big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
Well, hello, everybody. It is May the 16th, 2024, the year of our Lord, and a warm welcome to everyone for joining us on this live discussion on X and on YouTube. Today, we're going to talk again about COVID-19 and lessons learned, but in I think, a unique twist. And I think I just really am excited about our conversation with our special guest today. And I'm very glad to have so many of you join us. We really appreciate the comments that so many of you are offering. And it is really something how we get all those comments from coast to coast and other parts of the world. And it really means a lot to us. And just keep sharing what you're seeing. If it's important to you in terms of your life and the future of our country and frankly, so many parts of the world here, then please get the word out. One of the things that is really interesting as we reflect on COVID-19 is, again, what are the lessons? What have we really learned from those years of lockdowns, shutdowns, all kinds of challenges relative to vaccination? As we think about all the experts, all the messages you heard, I'd love to hear from you about what do you think are the lessons learned from COVID-19. And of course, you can pose your questions. We'll share them with the larger audience. So don't be bashful. We'd love to, again, hear from you. So today, I want to welcome a special guest on our program. His name is Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, and he is a friend. He's a colleague at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. He works with us not only as a senior fellow, but also works as a vice president there in terms of research. And Marco is also an author. You may notice his columns in various media across the country. But he has written a book called Canada's COVID, the story of a pandemic moral panic. And so we're going to dive more deeply into that. So a warm welcome to you, Marco, and thank you so much for joining us here today for this discussion.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Marco, I want to just dive into the book and understand it takes a lot to write a book like this. I certainly recommend it to our audience. It's a fine read. Why did you decide to write this book?
The real answer is fear, in a sense. I found myself in my little apartment in Calgary, pretty much isolated from the rest of the world, like everybody else, on March 11th in 2020, and fearing mostly for my loved ones and children. What's going to happen to them? And the media kept sort of throwing this word around, unprecedented, which means this has never happened. And I've read enough history to know I'm no expert in pandemics, or wasn't then, I think. But I know that there have been pandemics all throughout history, some of which have caused absolutely ravaging damage to civilization, especially in Europe and in Asia. And so I began to read more and more about what was going on and realized that when I started looking at the statistics and started looking at the numbers and started looking at the rates of infection and all of this, that it wasn't anywhere near some of the absolutely terrible killer pandemics, that this was more or less a serious one, but that we were driven by fear and panic. So the same fear that was driving public decisions was kind of the same fear that led me to look into this and started looking under the hood, as it were, and realize this is all wrong. There is a virus. The virus is infectious. The virus has the capacity to kill some people, but certainly no capacity to kill everyone. And the way that they were portraying us, we're all going to be dead, basically, if we don't do anything, all of the things that they were telling us to. So this led to a kind of an exercise of exorcism in trying to drive this fear out of myself by writing this. And somehow in the middle of all this, I connected with my good friend and colleague and former professor of mine, Barry Cooper, who had
Indeed.
also been thinking about the same things. And so we
Yeah.
decided to put our efforts together and write the first book, which came out in the fall of 2020. And
Mhm.
figured we leave it there because the reality is, we thought that this madness was going to end relatively soon. And on it went for another year, and on it went for another 8 months after that. And so we decided to update the small little book at the beginning and kind of document what had happened, because
Mm.
towards the end of when we were finishing writing the second manuscript, we realized that there were already things that we had seen on the web in data banks and websites, official websites, were already being scrapped and were disappearing. And so it became
Mm.
that much more important to document what had happened and when, so that we wouldn't get gaslit, essentially, as we are starting to be um, in a sort of serious and sometimes massive way.
Well, it's very interesting, Marco, and I've known you for a while here, but it's interesting you're upfront as a human being about the emotion of fear. And I think we all can relate and empathize with that theme, that very deep emotion of fear. I mean, that's a serious thing because I think what you referenced, trying to remember back, and a lot of us don't necessarily want to remember the past too much because obviously we want to move forward in our lives. But it was a very unnerving time because I think you're right, Marco, that there was a lot of messaging that suggested that this was a very, very serious virus, that it was going to, it was like the Spanish flu where you had very high mortality rates, in the 20s. As I recall, like upwards of 5% mortality and other populations. So it's very serious. So, what I find interesting, I mean, you are an accomplished expert in public policy. You're a researcher. You've taught at a number of universities, including Mount Royal. You've got a lot of background. So it's fascinating that even for you, as someone who looks at public policy, struggled with emotion initially around this issue. Is that right?
Sure. Um, as a political scientist, I learned early on in my studies that fear, as Thomas Hobbes would have us understand, is
Hmm.
one of the most, if not the most powerful motivator. And so, if you can uh, harness fear and use it as a kind of political tool, you can achieve a great deal. And this is essentially what happened here. You may remember that the first couple of weeks of March were we were making appeal to rationality, to coolness. The media was talking about keeping calm, learning more. The prime minister came off and said, "This is unlikely going to affect Canada." He was at the time in Ethiopia, of course, and then the narrative just changed quite rapidly when.
Hmm.
Some images from Italy and Spain and Iran and
Hmm.
and China started coming in, some of which were horribly exaggerated.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, we were comparing it to the Spanish flu, which is one of the most devastating pandemics the world has seen. And it wasn't all that long. It was about 100 years earlier. So
Hmm.
we had pretty good documentation of what had happened. In Alberta, everybody who was alive then knew of someone or a couple of someones who succumbed to the Spanish flu. It was terrible. We're
Hmm.
collecting bodies on the streets and whatnot. Uh,
Indeed.
it was really bad, but none of that was happening here. So it was clearly an indication that we were exaggerating horribly about what was happening.
Okay, so would you say, Marco, and not to put you on the spot, but would you say that you had a kind of an inkling that things were being overstated fairly early in terms of this crisis?
Yes, by the time some of the modeling came out,
Hmm.
some of which came out of came out of England, and they were predicting millions and millions of deaths in Alberta, thousands and thousands. And I realized that the assumptions of these models were horribly exaggerated,
Indeed.
that did not conform to reality, and that this was either a mistake or they were trying to scare the bejeebies out of us.
Exactly. And we're going to come to that whole issue of modeling. Certainly, when it comes to the so-called expert Neil Ferguson from the Imperial College of London, those were
Right.
quite the models that sent shockwaves around the world as they predicted tens of millions of deaths unless there would be lockdown. So, but but just going back to your point then about fear and your reference to the great political philosopher Sir Thomas Hobbes, is that that's clearly one of the lessons coming out of COVID-19 or any so-called crisis is that we need to collect our rational minds and not lose our minds when it comes to crises. Is that a fair lesson right off the top?
Oh yeah. Listen, and this is taps into fear from the start, right? Um, Pandemics are things that have affected humanity. The evidence shows that goes all the way to prehistory. We found
Mhm.
viruses
Yes.
among Cro-Magnon remains. So we in the Western world, especially, and in Canada, more or less right after 9/11. Um, the premier of Alberta, then Ralph Klein, decided that we should have some kind of emergency playbook.
Mhm.
David Redmond knows this story. You've heard bits and pieces of this from him, of course. And the whole
So,
point
so
of
just to
having,
clarify, so that's Colonel David Redmond. He's a
yes,
senior fellow at Frontier, and he was involved in preparing those emergency plans with a team of people, right?
that's right. And so we had, and not just in Alberta, but pretty much across the country, in every province, there is an emergency plan, and the emergency plan includes plans for viral pandemics, especially respiratory, which tend to be often the most common. And the whole point of having this plan is not to panic, that there is
Indeed.
a playbook
Yes.
that we can follow rationally, that there is a person in charge of the emergency actions, and that this person would consult with politicians, would consult with psychologists, would consult with engineers, would
Mm,
consult with water treatment guys, would consult with economists, would consult with
mm,
everybody, and come to a consensus about how to implement the plan depending on what the virus and the mortality of the virus is, and all these things, because all these things tend to be different. But the point is,
mhm.
there is a plan and there is a person in charge of the plan. What did we do in most Western societies, and especially in Canada as well, is we took the book and we threw it out the window.
Yes,
Uh,
indeed.
but
Yes.
right off the bat, and then we figured that because it was a virus, that we needed a doctor in charge, not even a doctor specializing in viruses or in epidemiology, but some doctor who also happens to be a bureaucrat. So which also tells you the kind of doctor that they are, because doctors want a doctor, they want to practice medicine. I have a
Mm,
certain suspicion about doctors who want to be bureaucrats to begin with, but
right.
those are the ones we put in charge. So for reference, here's the equivalent. Suppose, for example, that there was a volcanic eruption around the corner, and that we had an emergency because
Mhm.
there is a volcanic eruption, and so we go and find a volcanologist, and we put him in charge of the emergency system because the problem is a volcano. Or right at the tail end of COVID, we had the floods in BC, right? And so emergency plans kick in. And so we go and find a specialist in river floods, a limnologist, and we put him in
Mhm.
charge of the emergency effort because the problem is a river. Yes, the problem is a river, but the larger problem is an emergency. And so doctors, even when they are genius doctors about medicine, they don't know anything about economics. They don't know
Mhm.
anything about traffic. They don't know anything about schools. They don't know anything about a lot of stuff. And even if
Mhm.
they are extremely educated, they cannot possibly command all these subjects that the people who are specially trained to deal with emergencies either know the people to get in touch with to deal with this thing. So the same fear that we were trying to avert by having emergency plans is the same fear that seems to have led us to throw out the playbook and start from scratch with people who knew very little about emergencies.
I think you're
It's
absolutely
unbelievable.
right. Yeah, it's in retrospect, it is unbelievable that we threw out our emergency plans. I know as a former elected officials, we did regular tabletop exercises and all kinds
Right.
of emergency scenarios. And there's a real methodology and approach to managing emergencies. And as far as that goes, preventing them and also recovering from them. And we really haven't reflected comprehensively about what happened with COVID 19, which says a lot too. So there's a lot of kind of interesting questions to really get at the bottom of. And so I'm having this discussion with researcher and author Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, who's sharing more about his book, Canada's COVID, the story of a pandemic moral panic. And so when we think about the book, can you help us understand what really is a moral panic?
Um, yes, it's a fairly new sort of social science concept that is designed essentially to understand that there are situations that cause widespread societal fear, and that the fear is such that it far exceeds the actual danger or the perceived threat. So it's okay.
Mm,
It's okay to be fearful. There's lots of things that make us afraid,
yes,
but it's
yes.
the proportionality that speaks, for example, here to the moral panic. And so the essence of this here is, and this may sound like a quip, but it's not. Remember that we were being told we're all going to die, and
Mhm.
we're all going to die unless we observe these and these and these rules. That
Yes.
is, in fact, a driven fear in the sort of wideness of the population
Mhm.
that is far, 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 far exaggerated and way beyond the actual capacity of the virus to kill us. So
Mhm.
it is a kind of incitement to public anxiety and to public fear. And there are usually different players in this. And the media is usually the main driver of this in sort of modern societies. Uh, and
Interesting.
and in this particular case, it's not just the media, but also, of course, we have to remember that this was the first social media pandemic, and so there was lots of stuff moving around, trying to make people, maybe on purpose or maybe not, afraid. We don't subscribe to the idea, by the way, that all this was a conspiracy to grab power. All of these actors did not sit down in a single room and decided
Mm.
or committed to a concert of action. What simply happens is what happens with human beings. They are driven by their own interests, and so the media saw that. Hyping the pandemic was in their own interests because they could have more people buying their newspapers or glued to their screens with the numbers of cases rotating and changing every second. The politicians figured out that this was a way for them to amass more power. And we can talk about that. There's tons of examples in which, for example, different legislatures, but the Parliament of Canada specifically,
Mm.
sought
Mhm.
to give itself enormous powers, powers that the Parliament of Canada had not even ever given itself
Mhm.
during the Second World War, where there was a real existential threat to the existence of the country. The academics, ditto. They found interest in hyping the effect of all this. So all these people who were involved figured out that the more they hyped the fear of this, the more they seemed important to the rest of society. and
Okay,
increase therefore
uh,
their power.
so let's break that down a little bit. And again, I wish the audience to send us your questions and participate in this very important discussion, because I think you're really onto something here. You're getting at the self-interest of all these different actors involved. And so you cited the media. Well, the media wants an audience. So what better audience to have people's eyes and attention than to talk nonstop about a existential crisis, right?
Yeah.
You have also the politicians. And it's interesting. So you're alluding to that. Can you tell us more in the sense that I think a lot of Canadians would assume that that many political decisions are kind of based on that kind of thoughtful analysis where we look at the options, we look at our goals, we're breaking down what is the preferred option with the least impacts. That didn't really happen on so many levels, right? They were
Yeah.
looking more at, was it image, Marco, that you're surmising, that the sense that every politician wants to be a hero and wants to go along with the kind of narrative that's out there with the media. Is that what they're doing then? Is just to survive politically?
And I think it's maybe a little bit worse than that, in the sense that they either convince themselves or were trying to manipulate the public in believing that we were all going to die, and unless we did what they said, uh, then we were all going to die. So
Hmm.
if we complied with some of the nonsense rules, some of which made sense and many of which did not,
Hmm.
um, then that was the way to salvation. And so the prime
Hmm.
minister, for example, to pick on him, but pretty much all of them did the same thing in different varieties and different ways. That he said, we're going to save lives, and we will spare nothing. We will stop at nothing to
Hmm.
save, a single life. Think about what that means, right? That they were prepared to do absolutely anything at all, and that sends a signal that this is humongous, right?
Hmm.
And so from that point on, then the message is anything that government does will be justifiable because they're saving lives, right?
Okay, but this is really they're almost painting themselves in a picture because sorry, they're painting themselves into a corner. Pardon me, where as you escalate the fear and enable that fear that this is somehow an existential threat to your life, that's a horrible position to create because you're not really able to back away from those actions. And it seemed to me in retrospect that one of the things I noticed fairly early on is the absurd kind of contradictions among these recommended actions. You could go to Walmart, you could go to a liquor store, you could do a lot of things, but you couldn't go to, well, your school. You couldn't go to your place of worship. Like there's such massive contradictions that the narrative kind of cracks open. And you say, in retrospect, we knew fairly early on, and certainly there's been a lot of interviews with our friends, Dr. Martin Kuldorf and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, leading experts in their field in public health, that the mortality rates were quite low. But there were, in all fairness, risks. There are risks to a specific older population with multiple comorbidities, and that was a concern. So I guess you're caught in this challenge. How do you put all this into perspective in a way that people don't panic, like as you say, but we got carried away? Is that kind of what, am I understanding this, Marco?
In a way, yes. So think of it this way, and this is kind of one of the central arguments that we make in the book, is that there was a virus and there was fear. Normally,
Yes.
the way to deal with this is to bring the fears down, calm people down, and say we got a plan. We're gonna act on it. Don't worry, right?
Hmm.
And then proceed with the plan. So here we created this story in the book. We call it the plague story, right? Is
Hmm.
this story that we're all gonna die, and we know what we're doing. The reality is they didn't know what they were doing, and they kept thinking that this was something new. Excuse me. When the reality is pandemics are not new. So there is the plague story, And then as things began to sort of change and some things made no sense, they kept changing their story about, say, the masks or about the vaccinations or about all these things that they changed that made them look foolish and not worthy of following their advice, but also it made no sense. And Rex Murphy had a line in one of his great columns that said that at this point, he said, looking at the flip-flopping of all these things, the objective of all of this is to protect the narrative, not really to protect lives. And so there were all these things that were leaking out of the plague story that made people, or would have made people, realize that it wasn't true. And so all this coercion and all this pushing and all these restrictions became not not instruments of protecting lives, because we weren't all going to die and they already knew it, but it became a way to protect the bogus narrative of the plague
Wow.
story.
Fascinating. So, our audience, what do you think? Was there a lot of efforts to, in the end, protect a narrative that was not really accurate or true? What do you think? We'd welcome your questions. And speaking of narratives, I think one of the most powerful moments fairly early on in this whole pandemic crisis was the modeler that you referenced earlier, Neil Ferguson. And I want to play a clip that is very interesting because there's a lot of major questions now regarding what so many experts asserted as what was going to happen, and now are being really, in some measure, being called out around this. So I want to play that clip.
Fascinating that Professor Neil Ferguson has basically said that, look, he didn't push for restrictions. That wasn't his job. He was an advisor. But it's been made really clear in what the evidence was that was heard that they were aware that the impact of locking down would be devastating.
Yeah, but this wasn't discussed at the time, was it? Anyone who suggested this, pointing out not just the economic impact, but a whole heap of collateral damages because of lockdowns, were smeared as a COVIDiot, and the debate was shut down. And slowly but surely, the data comes down the tracks, and we see that actually lockdowns is probably the biggest public health disaster in the modern era. And what's shown from this as well is the one country in Europe, the outlier who went against that, Sweden, who kept everything open, schools, businesses, no mask mandates. Guess what? 3 years on, they've got the lowest excess death rates in the round.
And that, by the way, I need to stress to people, and that's compared with, includes all the other Nordic countries, because people say, oh, you can't compare Sweden with Britain or France or America because there's not as much population, blah, blah, blah. No, compared with other Nordic countries with similar populations, they have done way better when it comes to total excess deaths, not just of people in their 90s dying of COVID, but people in their 30s dying from untreated cancer, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it was all aspects. If we're talking about public health policy, it should be all aspects of health. And that seemed to be forgotten about a little bit as well, considering, look at our waiting lists now, at record levels, because there was a massive prioritisation towards COVID and nothing else. On every single level, this was a policy disaster. And this needs to be brought out in the inquiry. So it can never, ever happen again. We should have taken the road of Sweden. The government initially did, but they lost their nerve. And they lost their nerve because of people like Ferguson, inflated modelling, that those figures never actually came true, combined with a whirlwind of media attention to push Britain into forms of restrictions, mandates and lockdowns, which have caused huge economic damage.
A lot of pressure from the media. Again, the media showing all these pictures of what's happening in China. A lot of that we now know was actually just propaganda, people dropping down in the street and being picked up by ambulances.
So there you have it. That's a pretty powerful clip. So right off the top, was the management, the choice by so many countries, not all, like Sweden, one of the most historic policy fiascos in our history, Marco?
Absolutely. The commentator there is absolutely bang on. And chapter 6 in our book is dedicated largely to Sweden and to countries like Sweden who stuck with a plan. Sweden had an emergency plan. Surprise, surprise,
Indeed.
like most states, uh, and uh, and they stuck to it. There were times in which they got a little bit nervous, and there were complaints, but they stuck to their plan.
Mhm.
They essentially had the courage to stick with it, and they did remarkably better than most places. At some point, people here in Alberta started mentioning Sweden to the premier, and the premier had 3 or 4 pages up on the website, uh, sort of disclaiming why it was illegitimate to compare Alberta to Sweden. It was not, by the way. And then a couple of months later, that's one of the things that disappeared out of the website. There is an important.
It disappeared. It
Oh yeah,
disappeared from the website,
yeah,
e.g., like scrubbed off the website.
scrubbed off and is gone. Um, there's a
See,
point. There's a good point to make here about the models as well, because um, they were beating us over the head with this idea that science was on their side, right?
mm,
As though science
follow
is some kind of
follow
a
the
chorus.
science.
Follow the science,
Mhm.
we think follow the science was not urging you to follow the science, but it was a command: follow the science.
Oh,
uh, and
indeed. Yes, very good.
and and so they portray science as a kind of monolith in which everyone agrees, and the people who don't agree with the people who are on the side of science are some
Right.
kind of conspiracy theory,
Yeah,
rogue, etc., which is exactly the opposite of what science is.
indeed.
Science is a human activity, first of all. And so, because it is a human activity, there are different points of views, even sometimes
Mhm,
about the facts or what constitute facts.
mhm.
But what we saw here is a perversion of science, and we were beaten up over the head with a perversion of science that now leaves science, in the greater sense of the term, discredited, because people are now less inclined to believe when somebody waves science as a kind of oracle. Right?
Well said. I like the way you're thinking there, Marco. You can't do science if you don't have an open mind and you don't have open debate. I mean, it's a total contradiction. So well said. So I do have a question from the audience. So did Sweden do it right, and why?
Sweden do it absolutely right for several reasons. One, they stuck to the plan, and the plan included the mitigation of a wide variety of negative factors that come along with, for example, locking down. So they did
Mm,
not lock down because they knew that this would affect people's mental health, that it would affect the economy, that it would affect hospitals' scheduling for all other kinds of health issues, that it would affect literally the number of suicides, that it would affect so many different things. And so, what they were worried about, and this is why emergency plans are emergency plans, is that public health isn't just about a virus. Public health is capital P, capital H public health, which includes all other aspects of the health of society. And
mm,
instead, we ignored all of that stuff and concentrated on nothing but the
mhm,
infections of the virus, which is unbelievably close minded. The Swedes did not do that. The Swedes
mhm,
knew that if you lock people down, they're going to cheat anyway. And
mhm,
so they decided to leave people to their own devices and only
mhm,
clamp down if people went way, way, way out
mhm,
of bounds. But by and large, they trusted the public to follow the rules, which is what
mhm,
the exact
mhm.
opposite of what we did in Canada,
Right.
is that we treated
But
people like children,
I think you're right.
right. And
And
so,
Marco, on that note, I should just mention it's fascinating that you mentioned about the lockdowns and treating citizens as children and not to make their own decisions about their bodies and their health. There was this strange set of hundreds of cases in the public sphere where leaders who advocated for these lockdowns did not follow their own rules. You had all kinds of leaders. In fact, I
Neil
believe
Ferguson.
Neil Ferguson himself, yes, did not follow the lockdown procedures. And
Yeah.
that became kind of a scandal. And that happened all the time in Canada. I think there's There's so many good examples. So
there was one
in that
fellow
context,
there was one fellow in Manitoba who said that the rules didn't apply to the emergency personnel, and he was one of them, right?
well, I missed that one. That's
You
that's
might recall that.
bizarre.
But one more thing that should be said about Sweden is that part of the emergency plan of Sweden is to protect and maintain the integrity of democratic institutions. And so they wanted to protect people's rights as much as the integrity of the state and the government. That's not something that, for example, Ms. Tam or any of the
Hmm.
public medical officials understood that there is an important aspect of public officials to protect the constitutional rights of people and to protect the integrity of democratic institutions.
Indeed. So in terms of the book, if you had to summarize it, it's a great book. You go into so many different issues. What is the key takeaway point here in terms of the lesson learned? And does that lesson learned about moral panics and this horrible example of COVID-19, is that relevant now to other issues that we face as a society? Are they all up to, can we fall into this again so that we will fall into this kind of moral panic and, senseless fear and emotion that we can't make decisions that are really rational, that serves everybody?
Yes, unfortunately, unless we make a concerted effort to push back and reject what happened,
Hmm.
um, we will then be accepting the precedent that stampeding people into this kind of fear and taking away their rights and
Hmm.
abusing all kinds of manners of their dignity is okay. So first of all, we must do that. The second one, I think, is that it's okay to be fearful. There's nothing is human to be frightened,
Mm.
but we must not let uh, frightfulness and fear drive our lives. So, what we are required to do, we think, and we argue this in the book, is to exercise more courage, is to practice the art of becoming more courageous. Uh,
Mm.
but the third thing, and probably the most innovative thing about the book, is the analysis of how bureaucracies come to exert power on populations without there being any accountability. And
Ah.
the measure of tyranny, going back all the way to the Greeks, is when you have government acting in ways that are not accountable to the people that they govern. And when that happens, there is tyranny. We can argue about the shades and the depth and the intensity of tyranny, but acting um, on your own accord without being or wanting to be accountable to the people you govern is tyrannical. What we have here is, of course, not this was not Zimbabwe and this was not Belarus, but we starting to make steps towards that kind of stuff, and it's
Mm.
important that we become consciously aware of it. What is particularly bad about this type of sort of wishy-washy tyranny is that it's bureaucratic. And so, because it is bureaucratic, there is not a single person that we can identify and say he or she has the last word on it.
Mm.
Remember
Mhm.
that this was governed by a whole array of different medical officers, some at the federal level,
Mhm.
some at the provincial level, some even municipal powers, like Mayor Nenshi in
Mhm.
Calgary, began to sort of grab some of these powers that never belonged in a city or a municipal setting. And so Hannah Arendt is a political philosopher of totalitarianism that we reference in the book several times, had this idea that the worst possible kind of tyranny is a bureaucratic tyranny because there is no one really accountable as a face and as a voice. In a place where there is a bad tyrant, it takes a hero and a bullet
Mhm.
to remedy the situation.
Mhm.
But
Okay.
in a place where the power of the tyranny is so diffused in the state, it becomes very, very difficult to eradicate once it has set itself in.
All right, so there you have it, a brilliant summary by Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie. We're talking about his book with Dr. Barry Cooper. Um, I think your summation is very powerful. So the need to speak up and push back, for courage and for recognition that in this context, we've had a bureaucratic state of large proportions, many would say far too large now, that has really been given enormous power, and this really truncates, it undermines the democratic process and accountability. And I think that's true, Marco. If you reflect on the history of COVID-19, it's remarkable how we would turn out to a medical officer of health who really did not have the expertise at all and was not in keeping with any emergency plan. And I'm certainly, as someone who's had the history of going through crises, it's ultimately the elected officials that are responsible to the community to make those decisions regarding emergency situations. You would confer with a team of people that have insights regarding all the aspects of a community, as an example, or a nation. But ultimately, it's the elected official. And I'm wondering if something interesting happened here, Marco. And this is my theory, that a lot of the politicians were so concerned about the high level of fear. And of course, most politicians are most concerned about being reelected. And I'm not trying to vilify politicians, but it was a very attractive opportunity then to kind of be seen to be giving a lot of the calls and the authority, the decisions to these quote doctors. Um, and there's many different types of doctors, but it was totally presumptuous. So this whole idea was, let's hide behind the face, the image of the doctor. And ironically, as we've learned about court proceedings under oath, many of these public officials, the so-called heads of these issues from a public health point of view, later admitted that they were conferring very closely with those elected officials. So who was really in charge? Were the doctors really kind of a facade so the politicians could then make decisions, or who was actually making these decisions? Do you have a theory on that?
Yes, I think you put your finger on it. The politicians wanted to remain in charge, but didn't want to be the face of it, just in case
Mhm.
things went sideways. There is good precedent for this in Canada. Politicians since the 1980s, for example, have been deflecting the responsibility to make political decisions about
Indeed.
political issues and kick them to the courts. And so the courts made the decisions, and when the courts made by decisions, and they often do, then the politicians are insulated, and they usually pass it on, by the way, to a judge that they think is going to make the decision that they
Hmm.
want. And
Exactly.
so they have their cake and eat it. And
Hmm.
the result is, of course, that they politicize the courts, and also they undermine the authority and the respect for the courts as people see them politicized. And in here, we saw the same kind of pattern. They passed the hot potato to the doctors. They should have just left it, as we said earlier, in the hands of the capable hands of the emergency officials, and that would have been the end of it. But the politicians wanted both to be visible and to be invisible, and so that's why they slid the doctors into the limelight, and every now and then they would sort of come in to try to be in the frame. But
Mm.
as we saw, when things went south, it was the doctors who were making the decisions. Ultimately, if they gave the doctors the entire power to make the decisions, that's unlawful. Ultimately, the politicians are the only ones with the authority to make decisions for all of us.
Well said. So in this context, it really is stunning, Marco, the amount of things that we got wrong coming out of the management of COVID-19. And that's no offense to anybody, but they did a lot of damage to everyone. We know that the economic, social, health implications of how they managed COVID-19 are truly stunning. And this is in complete contrast with nations such as Sweden, who did follow the plan, as you said, and mortality rates are so much lower than certainly Canada, and the expense and everything. It's really remarkable. So on that note, one of the things I did want to share with the audience was kind of a larger summary that I did want to promote. We did have a discussion just a few weeks ago with the producer of an extraordinary documentary called COVID Collateral, and we wanted to share this clip as a kind of a summary of things, and I'd love to get your response, Barco, in the audience.
As the virus continues to spread, so does fear. Stay home.
To shelter in place.
Keep your foot on the accelerator, because that's what's going to get us through this.
The public did not know that there were prominent scientists that disagreed with the lockdown policies. They wanted to create an illusion of consensus.
And this was shocking to me in a free society to simply decree the lockdowns.
The federal government was working with social media companies, censoring dissenting opinions.
If the government is engaging in unconstitutional acts of censorship, who has the power to stop it?
It's just the most damning discovery.
Suddenly, just boom, you're fired and no explanation.
It was more than just silencing me, it was shutting me up.
Even though we had the data, the media just wasn't presenting the data fairly, and neither were the public health experts.
People that we've trusted to be knowledgeable are not. They're simply not.
All the information pointing to a cover-up, it's all public. It's all there in front of you. I think Congress is going to have a hard time really getting to the bottom of what happened.
Do you recall at some point anybody raising concerns to you at the beginning of the outbreak that the virus might have been genetically engineered or originated in a laboratory?
So there you have it. That's a clip from an extraordinary documentary called COVID Collateral. And so where do we go from here, Marco, as we look at this train wreck of public policy that has impacted tens of millions of people around the world? Where do we go from here to bring the truth, let alone bring some measure of healing? I have yet to hear really anyone in authority even apologize for these massive screw ups in terms of public policy decisions. It's really quite disturbing, is it not?
Yes. To my knowledge, the only person to have uttered an apology right off the top of her head when she was asked was the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith. But that's one among the whole lot of them. The reality is, and you're right to focus on an apology, because the first thing that needs to happen to move forward is that we need the acknowledgement that things failed. But things don't fail on their own. We've talked about the politicians failed, the medical establishment failed, the media failed, police services failed, the pharma industry failed, and the academy, as you just showed in that clip as well, failed. We have essentially a massive near total failure of all these institutions that are specifically designed to protect us in exactly these kinds of situations of emergency. The people that did not fail were the people who stood up and resisted it. Those are the people who ended up in Ottawa in February of 22. They did not fail. I think they understood that their lives and the democratic system in which they grew up was at stake, and they resisted. They were crushed, mind you, but I think they are one example of what did not fail. And because they are one example of what did not fail, they are an example to be emulated, right? We're going back to that courage. We're going back to speaking truth to power. We are talking about resistance against a form of oppression, albeit somewhat mild by comparison to other types of regimes. So in order to heal, we have to acknowledge that these mistakes were made, and then we have to take steps, necessary steps, to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
I think you're absolutely right. It is fascinating. I know that I have been in conversation with some of these leaders in Denmark. There is an extraordinary time that happened about 2 years ago, where in Denmark there were a variety of leaders from both the government, the media, and academia that did step forward in a reflective way to apologize to the nation regarding their inability to actually do their job. They did not rise to the occasion, and it was really quite extraordinary. I do want to learn more about that example, because I think that one of the true marks of courage and leadership would be to apologize for the mistakes that were made and say that never again. And it's interesting. I always marvel at the initiative of the National Citizens Inquiry, and Frontier is certainly part of that. Um, to be able to listen and hear the impacts that the management of COVID-19 did on it. It heard, I believe, was some 350 witnesses across the country. It's well documented. You can see that certainly on the Frontier newsletter, a steady drip of that video testimony. But go to the National Citizens Inquiry website. But I think that this is a very important question. Where do we go from here? Is it not, Marco, as we try to rebuild the trust with each other as citizens, and certainly with the so-called expert class and institutions that were supposedly there to serve us? And many of them, not all, but many of them utterly failed.
Yes, trust is the key here. We've lost trust in a lot of these people. Some of them already have been booted out of office, but we have also lost trust in institutions, and many of the institutions that failed us. So we need to reestablish and rekindle those sort of affections that, as a democratic, we have for our institutions. Um, and the key here, of course, is to remember. Um, Often in these kinds of situations, just the act of remembering is an act of defiance, given that the powers that be don't want you to know about these things. We think that our book, in some respects, is part of that effort to remember, because,
Indeed.
as I mentioned, so many things are being scraped of websites, or downright taken down, data and whatnot. And so our book documents in hard copy a lot of the things that took place. So we must remember in order to forge ahead. But the effort really is to rebuild those bonds of trust that are necessary for a functional democracy to exist.
Well said. And speaking of your book, I do recommend it. I think that's a great insight. This is a record of what's happened. I think it's well researched and very insightful. And it's interesting. I know that in preparation for this discussion, Marco, what was it like to try to sell this book? I know it's available on Amazon, but did you have a lot of success selling it in bookstores?
Not really. And my co-author and I, Barry, have talked about this. We had a little bit of help, sort of, with the cost of producing it. We might have broken even, maybe, so far. But the reality is, the book is being, by and large, ignored. I wish it were banned, actually, so that we could say that the book had been banned and sell some more. I'm kidding about that.
Yes.
The media and the culture is trying to move beyond this, and I think to some extent that's understandable. So we're not going to make millions out of this. The village in Switzerland is going to have to wait. But the purpose of the book really is to leave a record. and leave a record for those who want to consult it, for those who want to remember, and maybe not so much for this generation, but for the generations ahead.
That's one. Now, when we talk about accountability, obviously one of the critical institutions that has been very mixed regarding COVID-19 has been the courts. And we know that judges, the courts kind of exist within the cultural ether and chatter of our society. So, they're not immune. I do note the decision that was made just a few months ago that I thought it was a very impressive decision. I'd recommend people read it. And that was the decision that uh, clearly spelled out that the invocation and use of the Emergency Measures Act was unlawful, period. And that decision, I think one of the things that's so brilliant, it does reflect on the whole context in a full way regarding the data and information that we know. So we have a lot of cases that are happening that will probably bring some measure of accountability for people that were vaccinated. In fact, when it comes to people that are vaccine injured, many people don't even know that the federal government has a significant fund for vaccine injury. Just this week, there was a decision that regarding suspended workers from Canada Post, remote workers without pay. That policy went too far. And so, do you see signs of hope on the legal side, Marco, as you scan this situation? And are we going to get into a tipping point where all the things that we were told, whether it was from masks to the efficacy of the vaccines, and I know that AstraZeneca has now pulled off the market its vaccine product. Where is the tipping point that from the courts to other institutions will finally wake up that we got fact after fact, in quotes, wrong?
It's going to take a while because experts don't like to be wrong, just like politicians. The media isn't readily going to admit that they screwed up. Academics aren't readily going to admit that they screwed up. The courts themselves, which have screwed up as well, aren't readily going to admit that they do. So it is going to take some time to come to that tipping point. But you're right. There are certain vestiges that things are moving forward. Namely, and perhaps rightly, many of the vaccination cases are at that sort of tip of the spear. I think that's right and rightfully because what we did to the unvaccinated is probably the most shameful part of this sordid chapter. We unleashed on people in ways that if you replace unvaccinated with black or Pakistani or Muslim or
Indeed.
newcomer or whatever, we would be horribly ashamed of
Exactly.
saying and doing the things that we said and did about them. And many of our leaders led this charge of essentially making them out to be scapegoats about this at the federal level and at provincial levels as well. And so maybe it is poetic that some of the cases related to vaccination may be the ones that turn this around. Look, don't get me wrong. I don't have anything against vaccines. Neither do you. You and I have
Of
talked
course.
about this. But is the political effect of what took place of isolating and essentially creating an apartheid regime against the people who, rightly or wrongly, refused to be vaccinated. Let's say that they were all wrong. In a democracy, in a free society, we all are entitled and have the right to be wrong.
With the overreach of power and the harsh, uncompassionate, intolerant way,
The
like
desire to
any
punish.
horrible, horrible. So let us learn lessons from this because as we look to other public policy issues, you can hear the steady drumbeat of crisis after crisis being used again as Sir Thomas More, Hobbes, referred to, is a way to manipulate people. And this is what very much concerns me. So what do you see there is this being used again as another way to manipulate people on other issues as well, Marco?
Sure, there are already manifestations of it. Just look at the one thing, right? They are already predicting that this year there's going to be more greater and more horrible forest fires, most of which, by the way, are arson originating. And so they're already trying to whip people into fear about this doom of the environment, that the world is going to come to an end unless we turn off our electrical things, unless we don't travel, unless we don't eat meat, unless blah 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 blah. It's the exact same thing played out, but in a different way. They're trying to panic us about certain behaviors that they want us to stop, unless, of course, then the big fear of the planet and the world is going to come to an end.
Indeed. So let us learn from this book. It's a very insightful one, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you, Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie,
Thank you,
for
David.
taking this time and for your courage to speak up and to articulate this research and to challenge each of us to do our part as citizens so this never happens again. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David.
And on that note,